Chapter 12. Tom Sawyer Arrives. Jim wasn't on the raft. I knew in a minute what had happened. Someone must have spotted the raft and figured Jim was a runaway slave. Whoever it was had probably taken Jim into town to collect the reward money. I felt terrible. Jim was my friend, and even though I knew slavery was legal and all, in my heart I always hoped Jim would escape to be a free state. Now, because he had waited for me, because he was a loyal friend, he had been caught. My mind was all a jumble. I knew it wasn't right to break the law, but I just had to save poor Jim. I got to thinking about our trip down the river and how Jim and I had been together for so long. I could see him sitting by me, singing and laughing and doing nice things for me. Yes, sir, even if it would be against the law, I was going to find Jim and help him escape to freedom. The first thing that had to be done was to find out where they were keeping Jim. That wouldn't be so hard to do. In this part of the country, a runaway slave was always big news. Someone would be sure to know where he was. But I couldn't do anything that night, so I tied up the raft and slept until morning. First thing I did when the sun came up was to walk into town. It was a dusty, hot little place. Children were playing in the dirt road, and a couple of farmers were loading feed into wagons. I didn't want to appear too obvious, so I walked around for a spell. Finally, I sat down by one of the farmers and started shooting the breeze. The farmer began talking about the crops and all. Pretty soon he mentioned that some fellow had caught a runaway slave drifting down the river in a wooden raft. I acted like I didn't hear him, so he repeated the story a second time. Only this time he said the man's name. It was Phelps. Silas Phelps, a farmer from the next county. Phelps was holding Jim until he could find out more about him. As soon as I could get away without arousing the farmer's suspicion, I did. I started through the woods towards the next county. When I got there, it was all still and Sunday-like, hot and sunshiny. Everyone was in the fields, and there was a faint buzzing of bugs and flies in the air. It was lonesome, and it seemed like everybody was dead. Phelps's plantation was one of those little one-horse cotton farms. It looked just like all the other cotton farms along the road. I went towards the house, not fixing up any particular plan, but just trusting in fate to put the right words in my mouth when the time came. Just then a woman came running out the front door. She was all smiling and happy looking and waving her hand. "It's you, at last, isn't it?" she called. Before I had time to think, I answered, "Yes, ma'am, it is." The woman grabbed me and hugged me tight. She shook and shook, and the tears ran down her cheeks. "Dear, dear cousin Tom, I've waited so long to see you. Wherever have you been?" She didn't even give me a chance to answer, which was good. Before she started asking me all sorts of questions. Where was my baggage? How was the trip? What had taken so long? Was everyone back home all right? My mind could hardly keep up with her, but then I realized I had to come up with some answers. "My bags are at the depot, ma'am," I explained, "and the steamboat had engine trouble. That's why I'm late." When she invited me into the house, I began to get real uneasy. The questions were getting harder and harder to answer. There were children all around, and she introduced me to each one as Cousin Tom. I wanted to get the kids to one side to pump them a little and find out who I was, but it was impossible. The woman just talked a blue streak. At one point, she referred to herself as Aunt Sally, so at least I knew what to call her. Finally, Aunt Sally stopped for breath, but then she went on. "Well, here I am a running on this way, and you haven't told me a word about Sis or any of them. Now, I'll rest a little, and you start up on your news. Just tell me everything about everyone." Well, I could see I was in trouble now. I was just about to throw up my hands and admit everything when she grabbed me and pushed me behind a bed. "Oh, here he comes!" she cried. "Hide under here and we'll surprise him." I was really in a fix now. Her husband was coming home, and she wanted to surprise him. I had just one little glimpse of old Mr. Phelps when he came in. Then the bed hit him. Mrs. Phelps ran to greet her husband, asking, "Has he come?" "No," said her husband. "Goodness gracious!" she cried. "What in the world could have become of him?" Then she led the old man to the window. While his back was turned, she stooped down at the foot of the bed and gave me a pull. Out I came. When Mr. Phelps turned back from the window, there she stood, beaming and smiling like a house on fire. The old gentleman looked at me and asked, "Why, who's that?" Miss Phelps smiled and said, "Why, it's Tom Sawyer, that's who." I almost slumped through the floor. So that's who I was supposed to be. Only my best friend in the whole world. The old man shook my hand again and again, and the woman laughed and cried at the same time. I was just as happy to find out who I was. They were happy to see me. For the next 2 hours I answered all the questions they had about Aunt Polly, Sis, and Tom's half-brother Sid. Now I was feeling pretty good. Being Tom Sawyer was easy and comfortable, and it stayed easy and comfortable until I heard a steamboat coughing along down the river. Then I said to myself, suppose Tom Sawyer comes down on that boat, and suppose he steps in here any minute and sings out my name before I can throw him a wink to keep quiet. Well, I couldn't let that happen. So I told the folks that I was going into town to fetch my baggage. Mrs. Phelps wanted to go along with me, but I managed to talk him out of it. I started for town in Mr. Phelps' wagon, and when I was halfway there, I saw a wagon coming towards me. Sure enough, it was Tom Sawyer. I stopped and waited till he came alongside. "Hold on!" I shouted. Tom's mouth opened up like he'd seen a ghost. He swallowed 2 or 3 times like a person who got dry throat. Then he said, "I haven't done you any harm. You know that. So then what do you want to come back and haunt me for?" Tom really thought I was a ghost. He really believed I had died in the river. I had to laugh. Then I explained that I really was alive and told him everything that had happened on the river. Then I told him why I was here. "I want to steal Jim away and set him free," I said. I wasn't sure how Tom would react. He liked adventure all right, but Tom usually didn't do anything illegal. But his eyes lit up and he said, "Huck, I'll help you steal him." I was shocked. I never thought Tom would offer to help. This really was great news. So then I took Tom's trunk and put it in my wagon. We agreed that Tom would come up to the house later and pretend he was his own half-brother, Sid. That way we could both stay at the Phelps' house and work out a plan to set Jim free. When I got back to the house, dinner was all ready, and the whole family was waiting for me. About half hour later, Tom's wagon drove up, and Aunt Sally saw it through the window. She thought it was some stranger. Being the kind, generous people they were, Aunt Sally and her husband invited Tom inside. Tom waited till they had set a place for him at the table. Then he confessed that he was Sid and that he had wanted to come, so his mother had finally given in, and he had taken the next boat out of town. Well, there really was a celebration then. Aunt Sally didn't know what to do first. The kids all danced around, and it was like one big family party. We had dinner out in the backyard. There was enough food on that table for 7 families. Everything was hot and freshly made, too, but the whole time I kept thinking about where Jim might be and about looking for him as soon as possible.